So what I'm making here is a hammered copper ring, similar to the one I made in one of my previous videos. The difference with this one is the inner band has a fine silver lamination, and what that does is it helps keep the copper off of the skin and prevents kind of the green skin effect that happens with copper. Some people are fairly sensitive. I'm cleaning the inner band here so that when I put the flux on and have the inner fine silver band placed, when the solder flows, it'll flow all the way through. There won't be any dirt or grease impeding the flow. I'm getting the inner diameter of the copper band that I made, and I'm going to take this measurement, this inner diameter in millimeters. I'm going to subtract the thickness of my fine silver, which I roll out myself on my rolling mill, and it's always 0.55 millimeters. I'm going to subtract that from the inner diameter of the copper band, and then I'm going to multiply that by pi, 3.14, and that will give me the length that I need to cut my fine silver at. In this case it's 50.7. I get my fine silver from pawn shops or coin shops, places that sell bullion or silver rounds. It's quite a bit cheaper than buying from online jewelry sources. Marking the length, and next I'm going to measure the width of the copper band so that I can add a millimeter or a millimeter and a half extra to the fine silver sheet. That way, when it's placed inside the hammered, or when it's placed inside the copper band, it will protrude from either side by at least a half a millimeter. This will help prevent the solder from flowing over the edge and onto the inner band and contaminating the surface of the fine silver, because the solder, of course, has a lower purity, so it will tarnish a lot sooner than the fine silver, which probably won't tarnish much at all. Now, a lot of people don't think fine silver tarnishes, but it will discolor in the presence of chemicals or Alright, here I'm filing the edges of the fine silver sheet so that they're flush, or yeah, so that they will be flush. I mean, when I go and round the band up, you want it to be a nice fit, because with the fine silver, I'm not soldering it. I'm actually going to fuse it with the torch. That way I won't have to worry about the lower purity solder flowing around the inner band. I just made a little copper stand there to prop the fine silver up on, because the piece of steel that I had down there was covered in flux, and the flux would have flown up onto the band, changing the melting characteristics of wherever it touched. Just takes good torch control, and just watching really closely the surface of the fine silver. You'll start to see little specks start shimmering on the surface, and that's where impurities are on the surface of the fine silver, and they have changed the melting characteristics, and they begin to melt first. Yeah, just ease the flame on and off when you start to see that little shimmer on the surface, and eventually the whole surface will start to float. And once that happens, you want to back off. You don't want to push it, because the whole thing could just melt on you. Just doing a preliminary fitment check, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a chamfer with my file on the edge of the fine silver band, and with a half round file or a round file, I'm going to put a chamfer on the inner edge of the copper band. That way it'll be easier start to getting those two bands pushed together. Because you want a fairly tight fit with these. You don't want any voids, because some people say solder won't fill a gap. Solder will fill a gap due to surface tension. But there could be gaps in there that are much wider than you really want between the two bands, between the copper and the silver, and that could cause porosity in the join between the two bands. And I fluxed the inner part of the copper band before I tapped the fine silver in place. And that way, when I flow the solder, the capillary action will wick the solder down through, making a better connection between the two metals. Using a dapping punch to flare the edges out and make sure there's good contact between the copper and the silver. Just another step to help prevent porosity on the outer edges of the band once you file them. I'm adding a light coat of flux. I use a paste flux. Handy flux, actually. As I mentioned in a previous video, I've had the same jar for several years, I think. So yeah, light coating of flux around the edges of the band where the two metals meet. And with this, I use an extra hard solder that I make myself for the copper band join. So I can use a hard solder here for laminating the two metals together, but in the past, before I started making my own solder, I would use a hard solder for the copper band join, and then I would use a medium solder for laminating the two metals together. Medium will flow a lot better for you around the edge of the band. Hard solder, 75+%, can tend to be a little more lumpy, and it won't wick as nicely into the join between the two metals. I cut 8 pieces of solder, and I put 4 on each side, evenly spaced. That's actually probably overkill, but I would rather have a complete fill on the interface between the two metals than to have areas where there's voids, because that's a pain to fix later. I'd rather just file the excess off. Heating around the whole band, trying to bring it up to temp, but once I start to see the flux turn clear, I will start to focus on the solder bits closest to me, and then I'll work my way around the ring as they start to flow, trying to steer clear of the join on the copper ring. You do not want that to flow. If it flows, it'll get sucked into the join and around the inner part of the interface where the fine silver and copper are touching. So it'll basically suck it out of the join, and you'll have a problem to fix later that you really don't want to have to fix. So yeah, avoid the copper join. It's just torch control. I'm doing the other side. I applied another thin, fresh coat of flux on the opposite side that I didn't solder yet, and the same method applies, just going around getting the band heated up, watching for the flux to turn clear, and once it does that, I focus on the solder piece closer to me, and I work my way around the band, flowing each piece in succession, and into the pickle it goes. And yeah, my other videos show how to actually hammer the ring and finish it.